October 4, 1957. On a quiet night in Long Island, radio engineers at an RCA laboratory were listening for something else entirely. Their receivers, giant metal dishes aimed at the heavens, were tuned to a specific frequency, waiting to track the signal of a new American rocket that was scheduled to test its engines. Suddenly, through the familiar hiss and crackle of static, a new sound appeared. It was a sound no human had ever heard before, a transmission that did not originate from Earth. It was faint, rhythmic, and utterly unwavering. Beep, 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 a simple, clean, and profoundly alien pulse, repeating every 0.3 seconds. It was coming from above, miles above the atmosphere, moving at an impossible speed of 18,000 miles per hour, racing across the night sky. The engineers, bathed in the pale green glow of their oscilloscopes, felt a cold dread settle in their stomachs. This was not their signal. This was Sputnik 1, the Soviet Union's machine, and its message was clear. They had conquered the ultimate high ground. The paradox was immense and immediate. How could a polished aluminum ball, 23 inches across, weight of a grown Labrador, terrify the world's richest superpower into spending $250 billion and hurling 3 men to the moon inside a decade? The answer lay in the swift, hysterical political reaction that followed, an explosion of fear that seized Washington and shattered the illusion of American technological invincibility. For years, the United States had rested on the bedrock of unquestioned supremacy, with the Eisenhower administration clinging to the doctrine of massive retaliation, believing its global bomber fleet was the ultimate deterrent. Sputnik proved that defense strategy was instantly obsolete. The fact that the Soviets could place a satellite in orbit meant, in the terrified calculus of the Cold War, that they possessed an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of striking any American city without warning. The White House initially attempted to suppress the panic. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a 5-star general, possessed classified U-2 intelligence indicating the Soviet ICBM arsenal was minimal. He dismissed the satellite as a small ball in the air, believing his military position was secure and prioritizing fiscal prudence over public spectacle. This presidential stoicism, however, was immediately seized upon by his political opponents, not as calm leadership, but as dangerous and negligent complacency. The Democratic Party, led by the ruthlessly ambitious Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon B. Johnson, saw Sputnik as the perfect weapon. Johnson recognized the crisis as a political opportunity to break Eisenhower's defense budget limits and cast the Democrats as the sole party capable of saving the nation. Within days, Johnson transformed the Senate caucus room into a stage for a national drama, convening the Senate Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee. These hearings were designed not to uncover facts, but to amplify the national panic and assign blame to the Republican administration. Johnson, a master of political theater, dominated the proceedings. His physical presence loomed over the witness table as he relentlessly questioned defense officials. He focused with cold intensity on the existence of a missile gap, a term his committee coined and relentlessly promoted. He forced high-ranking officials, including Deputy Secretary of Defense Donald A. Quarles, to publicly confront the systemic failures of the administration. Johnson zeroed in on the inter-service rivalry that had stalled the American satellite program, revealing that the Army's powerful Jupiter C rocket, under Wernher von Braun, had been deliberately restricted from a satellite launch a year earlier to avoid upstaging the Navy's preferred Vanguard project. Johnson's narrative was simple and devastating. The administration had prioritized bureaucratic turf wars and budgetary caution over national security. The press dutifully reported the drama, echoing Johnson's condemnation that the American technological lag was a direct result of leadership failure in Washington. The hearings became a sustained political bludgeoning, shattering public trust in Eisenhower and successfully priming the American psyche for the deep, pervasive anxiety that followed. The political noise emanating from Washington metastasized into a pervasive, missile gap paranoia that gripped the entire nation. This was no longer just a policy debate. It was a societal contagion, a psychological blitz amplified by a media that saw ratings and circulation soar with every new fear. Newspaper editorials and sensationalist reports across the country hammered the narrative of an America suddenly exposed. The New York Times declared the satellite a stark demonstration of communist superiority. Life magazine dedicated cover after cover to the terrifying diagrams of Soviet ICBM trajectories, transforming the abstract threat of communism into a terrifyingly concrete, geographical danger that could reach every corner of the country. This cultural climate of fear was deliberately reinforced by the production and broadcast of public service announcements, PSAs, during primetime television. These were explicit instruction manuals for the nuclear age. They featured calm, mid-century families engaging in the bizarre new normal of building fallout shelters in their backyards, showing how to stock cinder block bunkers with canned goods and emergency supplies. The underlying message was chilling. Nuclear war is now a domestic contingency. The fear bled immediately into the American education system, resulting in the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, of 1958. Political leaders and cultural critics universally declared that the Soviet victory was a direct result of a soft, non-scientific curriculum. The NDEA mandated a massive federal infusion of funds to overhaul instruction in science, mathematics, and foreign languages, creating a generation of students, the Sputnik generation, who were told their homework was now a critical front in the Cold War. The overwhelming collective anxiety drove the nation toward a single focal point, the promised American victory. The stage was set for America's first official satellite launch, the Navy's much-touted Vanguard TV-3, carrying the entire burden of national hope and expectation. The world was invited to watch the triumphant answer. The political pressure on the Vanguard TV-3 launch team at Cape Canaveral was unbearable. The world was watching, the American public was desperate, and the entire political establishment was prepared to either celebrate or condemn. The launch was scheduled for December 6, 1957, a moment intended for national redemption. The Vanguard, a slender, elegant three-stage rocket, stood on Launch Complex 18A, carrying a tiny 3.25-pound satellite, a minimal payload burdened with maximal prestige. The final countdown proceeded with excruciating slowness. At T-10 seconds, the sequence was irreversible. At T-1, the engine ignited, a sudden, deafening roar. For precisely 2 seconds, the rocket rose, achieving a total height of barely 4 feet. At T+2.0 seconds, the massive engine abruptly lost all thrust and cut out. For a heart-stopping, split-second instant, the colossal vehicle hung suspended. At T+2.2 seconds, the rocket began its slow-motion fall back onto the launch pad. The highly pressurized kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen oxidizer in the first stage tanks slammed against the steel launch structures. At T+2.5 seconds, the Vanguard TV-3 detonated in a churning cloud of black smoke and orange flame. The rocket crumpled and disintegrated. The final, absurd insult was the sight of the small, polished silver payload, the satellite, ejected by the blast, bouncing across the concrete pad, its antenna deployed, emitting a frantic, pathetic radio signal, having launched, failed, and landed all within 3 seconds. An absolute stunned silence fell over the international press corps. The journalists, gathered for a triumph, had instead witnessed a national humiliation broadcast in real time across the globe. The international reaction was instantaneous and savage. The London Daily Mail ran the famous, devastating headline, "Sputnik." The Soviet news agency TASS reported the failure with thinly veiled sarcasm. The U.S. rocket was instantly branded by the world media as Flopnik, Puffnik, and Stay-Putnik. The Vanguard disaster was the final, undeniable proof in the American mind that the missile gap was not only real, but that the American system was dangerously incompetent. All of Eisenhower's attempts to minimize the threat vanished in the cloud of black smoke that hung over Cape Canaveral. The nation was now convinced of the necessity for radical, massive action. The Vanguard disaster was the final, devastating blow to the political credibility of the Eisenhower administration. It eliminated all plausible deniability regarding the missile gap and forced the president to act decisively against the perception of American weakness, which was now a geopolitical fact. His subsequent actions were a direct concession to the political pressure generated by Lyndon Johnson and the overwhelming national anxiety. Eisenhower's response was characteristically strategic, a systematic reorganization designed to inject urgency into the U.S. effort and bypass the exact bureaucratic bottlenecks that had led to the humiliation at Cape Canaveral. In January 1958, the President authorized two critical institutional creations that would permanently reshape the American scientific and defense landscape. First, he established the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, within the Department of Defense. ARPA was given a mandate to pursue revolutionary, high-risk, game-changing technologies, specifically missile and satellite systems, free from the stifling constraints of inter-service rivalry and traditional military procurement. It was intentionally designed to operate with a flexible, almost limitless budget, functioning as the nation's technological special forces to accelerate the closing of the military gap. Second, Eisenhower finally and crucially lifted the restrictions on the Army's missile team. General John B. Madaris and the German rocketry genius Wernher von Braun, whose powerful Jupiter C rocket had been held back for over a year, were given an emergency, 90-day deadline to succeed where the Navy had failed. This was an act of pure political necessity, an urgent attempt to restore national morale. The von Braun team, operating out of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, ABMA, in Huntsville, Alabama, worked under a focused, round-the-clock urgency. They used the proven Jupiter C rocket, which had already been perfected through atmospheric re-entry trials. On January 31, 1958, less than 2 months after the Vanguard catastrophe, the Jupiter Psi soared off the launch pad. The ascent was clean and powerful, and the rocket successfully placed the Explorer satellite into orbit. The nation had its first successful answer, finally transmitting the American beep, 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 that symbolically broke the Soviet sound barrier. Explorer I provided the desperately needed national morale boost, and its instruments, led by physicist James Van Allen, immediately made a genuine, non-trivial scientific discovery: the intense radiation band surrounding Earth, the Van Allen belts. This success was immediately followed by the most significant structural change of the era, the passage of the National Aeronautics and Space Act in July 1958, which created NASA. Eisenhower envisioned NASA as a clear separation of military and civilian space endeavors, maintaining the high ground of space as a peaceful, scientific frontier. However, politically, NASA became the direct, focused national mobilization against the missile gap. It was an unprecedented commitment of national resources, a permanent federal infrastructure designed not just to launch satellites, but to dominate space entirely. The Sputnik crisis had successfully forced the creation of the modern American space and defense apparatus, ensuring the Cold War would now be waged with scientific budgets and orbital deadlines. Yet, despite the success of Explorer I and the establishment of NASA, the Soviet Union was not finished applying pressure. The Kremlin understood that the space race was a narrative war, and they responded to the American comeback with a calculated and devastating cascade of technological firsts. Throughout 1959 and 1960, the Soviet Union achieved a series of stunning successes, each one designed to remind the world of their fundamental lead in rocketry: the first probe to fly past the moon, the first probe to successfully impact the moon, and the first photographs of the moon's far side. These achievements ensured that the missile gap remained the dominant, terrifying political reality. This atmosphere of relentless Soviet achievement, amplified by Lyndon Johnson's continuous political pressure, created the perfect environment for a new generation of leaders. The most potent challenger to the established order was Senator John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, campaigning for the presidency in 1960, seized on the missile gap as his central theme, using it as a direct indictment of the Eisenhower administration's perceived complacency. He asserted that the gap was real, arguing that the Soviet lead in space and missiles was not merely a military problem, but a failure of American national will. Kennedy promised a decisive, massive effort to restore American prestige and security. Kennedy's victory solidified the political mandate for a radical expansion of the space program. The nation was now led by a figure who had staked his political career on the urgency of closing the gap. Yet, the final, undeniable proof that the U.S. remained behind came just months after his inauguration. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth. Gagarin's flight was the ultimate demonstration of Soviet engineering confidence, proving they had the rocketry power, the guidance systems, and the life support technology to place a man in orbit and return him safely. The world hailed it as a monumental achievement, and it was the final, stinging reminder to the American establishment that incremental steps would never be enough to win the psychological war. President Kennedy and his inner circle, including Vice President Lyndon Johnson, immediately initiated a strategic review. Simple, incremental victory would not suffice. The U.S. needed to set a goal so immense, so technologically demanding, that the Soviets could not possibly match it in the short term. The decision was made to leverage America's vastly superior economic strength, industrial base, and computing power against the Soviet Union's short-term lead in large rockets. The ultimate objective, they concluded, must be the moon. The tiny beeping sphere from 1957 had successfully forced the United States into the most audacious, expensive, and monumental technological undertaking in human history. The political fallout from Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight in April 1961 was not just disappointment, it was an existential blow that struck at the heart of the young Kennedy administration. The Soviet Union had placed a man in space, securing a monumental psychological victory that validated every fear generated by Sputnik and the missile gap paranoia. The pressure on President Kennedy was immense, amplified by the same political forces that Lyndon Johnson had unleashed years earlier. The incremental approach of the early American space program was clearly inadequate. President Kennedy, seeking counsel, turned to his most trusted advisors, including Vice President Johnson, who had his finger on the pulse of the national anxiety, and Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist whose expertise was now the nation's greatest asset. The question was no longer if America should commit to a massive effort, but what single monumental goal could the U.S. guarantee to reach before the Soviet Union, and what goal would truly neutralize the Soviet propaganda machine once and for all. Von Braun's assessment was critical. He affirmed that while the Soviets currently had the lead in large boosters, the sheer complexity of a lunar mission, requiring immense industrial capacity, advanced computer guidance, and a long-term sustained commitment, played directly into America's strengths. The U.S. had the money, the infrastructure, thanks to the creation of NASA and ARPA, and the superior computing technology necessary to solve the decade-long engineering puzzle. The experts converged on the most audacious goal in human history, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. This objective was not chosen for its scientific merit alone. It was a political calculation of the highest order, designed to bypass the immediate Soviet lead by aiming for a target only the economically and industrially superior American system could sustain. On May 25, 1961, President Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered the speech that launched the Apollo program. The speech was a call to arms, framed not in terms of exploration, but as a clear, direct challenge for global supremacy, the ultimate and final answer to the three simple beeps of Sputnik 4 years earlier. The president declared that the nation must commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. The political genius of this goal was layered. Firstly, it required a total mobilization of national will and resources, justifying the massive federal spending that the missile gap crisis had already rendered necessary. Secondly, the clear deadline, before this decade is out, created a simple, universally understood metric for success, a finish line visible to the entire world. Most importantly, it was a technological leap that reset the clock. Neither superpower yet possessed the necessary hardware or know-how, forcing the race to begin effectively from an equal footing on an entirely new scale of difficulty. The decision represented the culmination of the political panic and institutional restructuring born from the fear of Sputnik. A tiny, 23-inch aluminum sphere, designed only to broadcast 3 rhythmic beeps, had successfully terrified the world's richest nation into an existential commitment of resources. The story of American technological complacency was over, replaced by a decade-long frenzy of engineering and ambition designed to prove once and for all that the American system could not be beaten. The space race now had a singular, ultimate target, demanding the creation of the largest, most complex machine ever conceived, the Saturn V rocket. The commitment of resources was unlike anything seen in peacetime history. NASA's budget exploded, growing from less than $500 million in 1960 to nearly $5.2 billion by 1965, consuming over 4% of the entire federal budget. This funding cascaded through America's universities and corporations, fundamentally restructuring the aerospace and electronics industries and creating entirely new fields of computing and material science. The Moon program was a direct, colossal manifestation of the political panic, a $250 billion undertaking aimed at curing the national insecurity instilled by a 184-pound ball. The race was now officially on, and the sheer scale of the challenge demanded that every engineering decision, every budget allocation, and every political maneuver be focused on one goal: defeating the legacy of the beeping menace. The next phase of the story would be the construction of the colossal machine required to bridge the gap, a machine of unprecedented scale and power. The political pressure had secured the funding. The next phase was the Herculean task of engineering. The goal, to land a man on the moon and return him safely by 1969, was a technological problem without precedent. It was a problem so vast that it required the creation of an entirely new machine, a device of such immense scale and power that it seemed to defy physics itself: the Saturn V rocket. Wernher von Braun, now heading NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, was charged with building the booster that would lift the American flag to the moon. The Saturn V would stand 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It would weigh 6.2 million pounds when fully fueled, and its 5 massive F-1 engines in the first stage would produce 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. This was more power than the combined output of all 10 of the most powerful hydroelectric dams in the United States at the time. The engineering challenge was not merely about size, it was about precision under unbelievable stress. The rocket was a complex, multi-stage machine built with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, yet designed to withstand atmospheric turbulence, intense vibration, and internal pressures that pushed materials to their absolute breaking points. The fuel alone, kerosene in the first stage, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in the upper stages, required a cryogenic infrastructure that was itself a massive feat of engineering. The liquid hydrogen, stored at -423 degrees Fahrenheit, was colder than any naturally occurring substance on Earth. This monumental expenditure of industrial might, the $250 billion commitment, was the true and final answer to the little beeping sphere. Sputnik had demonstrated the Soviet Union's ability to create a powerful single-launch vehicle, the R-7 missile used to launch Sputnik. The Saturn V, by contrast, represented the overwhelming, sustained industrial and economic superiority of the American system. The Soviets could manage single dramatic stunts. The U.S. could build a vast, complex, reliable production line for miracles. The psychological impact of the moon race permeated every level of the space program. Every failure, every budget dispute, and every setback was viewed through the lens of the missile gap and the fear of Soviet victory. The engineers working 17-hour days did so under the unspoken understanding that they were not just building a rocket, they were restoring national honor. They were exorcising the persistent anxiety that had plagued the nation since that quiet night in 1957. Beyond the rocket, the challenge necessitated the rapid development of technologies that simply did not exist. Navigating a small capsule across 250,000 miles of empty space and landing it on a moving target required onboard digital computers, small, rugged machines capable of complex calculations in real time. The guidance system, which would ultimately fly the lunar module to the surface, was a technological marvel, transforming electrical impulses into physical maneuvers with flawless precision. Every component, from the heat shield necessary to survive atmospheric re-entry to the food pouches consumed by the astronauts, had to be invented, tested, and mass-produced at a pace previously confined to wartime mobilization. The sheer scale of this unified, focused effort was the final proof of the profound shock induced by Sputnik. It was the only way to ensure that America never again faced a geopolitical reality where a rival's simple technical achievement could be misinterpreted as a fatal strategic flaw. The Saturn V, the Apollo spacecraft, and the complex human systems built around them were the concrete manifestation of the national trauma, a massive technological edifice built upon a foundation of fear and wounded pride. The massive technological infrastructure of the Apollo program, the Saturn V rocket, the cryogenic fuel systems, the digital guidance computers, was the physical answer to Sputnik, but the psychological burden fell squarely on the shoulders of the astronauts and the thousands of scientists and engineers. This was not merely a race against the Soviet Union, it was a race against the calendar and the persistent national fear of failure. Every day that passed was another day the Soviets might produce a shocking new first. The original 7 Mercury astronauts, the first chosen to carry the nation's hopes, were elevated to instant celebrity status, yet they operated under an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Their training was brutal, designed to simulate the G-forces, isolation, and sensory deprivation of spaceflight. They were the visible symbols of a nation fighting to regain its confidence, constantly aware that their performance was directly linked to the country's geopolitical standing. The pressure to succeed was so profound that it fostered an atmosphere of near-religious fervor within NASA. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to apply pressure, demonstrating that their lead was not limited to rocketry. Following Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight, the Soviets achieved the first tandem flight, the first woman in space, and the first multi-person crew, maintaining the narrative of incremental but relentless superiority. Each Soviet first sent shockwaves through Washington and fueled the Apollo program with renewed, almost desperate urgency. This constant, high-stakes competition forced NASA to adopt a go-fever mentality. The engineers and managers understood that the moon landing was the singular goal that mattered, and any technical risk deemed manageable had to be accepted to meet the political deadline set by President Kennedy. They had to beat the Soviets to the moon, not just for pride, but to conclusively end the missile gap paranoia that had crippled American foreign policy for nearly a decade. The program's structure itself became a marvel of management, a massive, unified effort employing over 400,000 people across more than 20,000 individual companies and universities. This scale, unimaginable in the Soviet system, was America's true weapon. They were fighting the battle of industrial capacity, where the sheer volume of brainpower and resources applied to the problem guaranteed a solution. Yet, built into the immense scale of the effort was the ever-present danger of catastrophe. The haste, the complexity, and the reliance on newly developed, untested systems meant the Apollo program was constantly flying on the edge of failure. The irony was profound. The fear of a perceived Soviet weapon, the ICBM, had forced the U.S. to build a real weapon, the Saturn V, and that construction process was itself highly dangerous. The final culmination of the fear and the fervor came not with a launch, but with a terrible tragedy. A failure that would demonstrate the lethal cost of the go-fever mentality and reinforce the immense human stakes of the entire endeavor. It was a moment of sobering reality that brought the entire national effort to a screeching halt, proving once again that in the unforgiving environment of the space race, even a tiny technical flaw could exact the highest price. The relentless drive to meet the political deadline, to put a man on the moon before this decade is out, finally exacted a lethal price. The constant competition with the Soviets, the institutional paranoia of the missile gap, and the sheer speed of development resulted in a fatal cutting of corners and a dangerous complacency about internal procedures. The fever mentality that had energized NASA was about to become a tragedy. On January 27, 1967, Apollo 1 astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were sealed inside their command module on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy for a full-scale plugs-out test. This was a rehearsal for launch, where the crew would run through the count with the spacecraft operating entirely on internal power, simulating its readiness for flight. The command module was pressurized with pure 100% oxygen. This atmosphere, chosen for its light weight and simplicity in space, was a deadly fire accelerant on the ground. Furthermore, the interior of the capsule was lined with miles of exposed wiring and flammable materials that should have been removed or replaced, but were overlooked in the rush to meet the schedule. At 6:31:04 p.m. EST, a small electrical spark, likely from a frayed wire near the floorboards, ignited the pure oxygen atmosphere. The fire spread with terrifying speed and intensity. Within the command module, the temperature skyrocketed to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds. The astronauts knew immediately they were in mortal danger. They desperately shouted warnings over the communication line, but the fire was consuming their spacecraft faster than they could react. Ed White struggled to reach the complex inward opening hatch, which was impossible to open against the intense internal pressure created by the rapid combustion. Within 17 seconds, the fire had reached the cabin wall. Within 30 seconds, all communication from the crew ceased. The pure oxygen environment had turned the highly complex, multi-million-dollar command module into a white-hot pressure cooker, killing the 3 men instantly. The catastrophe was not just a failure of engineering, it was a devastating indictment of the political urgency driving the program. The investigation that followed was ruthless, revealing hundreds of flaws in the spacecraft's design, manufacturing, and safety protocols. NASA was forced to confront the terrible reality. In its desperate haste to beat the Soviets and exorcise the ghost of Sputnik, it had built a death trap. The Apollo 1 fire brought the entire American space program to a grinding halt for 18 months. It forced a complete, painful reevaluation of every component and every procedure. The pure oxygen environment was replaced with a more stable oxygen-nitrogen mix. The flammable materials were removed, and the complex hatch was redesigned to open quickly and safely. The tragedy served as a brutal final lesson derived directly from the missile gap paranoia. The fear of Soviet supremacy was lethal, not just because it threatened national security, but because the feverish speed required to answer it could kill American heroes on the launch pad. The engineers and managers who survived the ordeal emerged with a renewed, grim determination. The rush was over. They would proceed with absolute safety, not just to beat the Soviets, but to honor the fallen by completing the mission under the highest possible standards. The political mandate remained, but the methods had changed forever. The catastrophic Apollo 1 fire in January 1967 did not end the dream of reaching the moon. It redefined it. The 18-month pause forced by the tragedy became a period of intense, rigorous overhaul, driven by the grim mandate to eliminate the lethal shortcuts born of the go fever mentality. The engineers and managers of NASA, sobered by the loss of Grissom, White, and Chaffee, emerged with a renewed, uncompromising commitment to safety and engineering excellence. The political mandate, to defeat the specter of Sputnik and the missile gap, remained absolute, but the method was now absolute precision. The program was reorganized, and the redesigned Apollo command module was declared ready for manned flight in late 1968. However, the schedule was impossibly tight. To meet President Kennedy's deadline of landing a man on the moon before this decade is out, NASA needed a radical acceleration of the test sequence. There was no time for the planned slow, deliberate buildup of orbital tests. The ultimate challenge was the Saturn V rocket. Standing 363 feet tall and generating 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the immense booster was powerful, but unproven in manned flight. The original plan called for multiple unmanned and low Earth orbit tests, but intelligence reports indicated the Soviets were preparing a monumental final effort. They were launching high-profile, unmanned lunar probes, the Zond missions, that could potentially orbit the moon and return to Earth before the U.S. could even get close. The threat of a Soviet circumlunar first, the psychological equivalent of a second Sputnik, was intolerable. The political anxiety generated by the missile gap was still too raw to risk this final humiliation. The decision was made to execute one of the boldest gambles in engineering history, Apollo 8. In September 1968, NASA management decided to bypass the intervening test flights and send Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders directly into orbit around the moon. The mission was a terrifying leap of faith. It would be the first time humans flew on the mighty Saturn V rocket, the first time they traveled beyond Earth orbit, and the first time they were committed to a trajectory that required the engine of the command module to fire perfectly to avoid being flung into deep space forever. The launch of Apollo 8 on December 21, 1968, was the most tense moment since the Vanguard failure. The entire world watched, knowing that a catastrophe would not only kill 3 men, but likely doom the entire Apollo program. The Saturn V performed flawlessly. After 3 days of translunar coast, the crew successfully entered lunar orbit on Christmas Eve. The mission was an unparalleled psychological triumph. As the 3 astronauts orbited the desolate cratered surface of the moon, they performed a series of broadcasts that captivated the world. But the defining moment was the Earthrise photograph. As the crew rounded the far side of the moon, they saw the vibrant blue, white, and brown sphere of Earth rising above the barren gray lunar horizon. This single image, broadcast and printed across the globe, was the final, definitive psychological answer to the beeping menace of Sputnik. It refocused the world's attention not on a weaponized fear, but on the fragility and shared fate of humanity. Apollo 8 proved the overwhelming superiority of the American technological system. It demonstrated the complex, reliable, and sustained effort that the Soviet system, hampered by secrecy and political infighting, could not match. The race was now effectively over. The question was no longer if America would get to the moon, but when. The success of Apollo 8 in December 1968 delivered the strategic victory to the United States, conclusively proving that the American system could achieve the complex lunar journey. The mission neutralized the threat of a Soviet circumlunar first and allowed NASA to proceed with the final goal under the high standards of safety and excellence earned through the terrible lesson of the Apollo 1 fire. The psychological damage inflicted by Sputnik and the missile gap was finally beginning to heal. The subsequent missions, Apollo 9 and Apollo 10, were methodical and successful, rigorously testing the lunar module and orbiting the moon in a final dress rehearsal. The stage was set for the ultimate climax of the decade-long frenzy. On July 16, 1969, at Cape Kennedy, the mighty Saturn V rocket, the monumental industrial answer to the small beeping Soviet sphere, lifted off with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins aboard. The 7.5 million pounds of thrust generated by the 5-of-1 engines represented the zenith of the national commitment, a sheer outpouring of resources dedicated to ending the paralyzing fear that had gripped the nation 12 years earlier. The flight was a global spectacle. Over 600 million people, the largest television audience in history to that point, tuned in to witness the final hours of the race. The entire world was watching the conclusive test of which political and economic system, the transparent industrial powerhouse of the United States, or the secretive rocketry-focused Soviet Union, would ultimately prevail. On July 20, 1969, the lunar module Eagle, piloted by Neil Armstrong, successfully navigated its way past boulders and craters to land on the Sea of Tranquility. Armstrong's voice, crackling across the 250,000 miles of space, delivered the message the world had been waiting for. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Hours later, as Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, he delivered the single most powerful statement of the Cold War era. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. The achievement was instantaneous and total. It was the final, definitive answer to the rhythmic beep, 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 that had pierced the quiet night of October 1957. The psychological grip of the missile gap was irrevocably broken. The American system, fueled by open competition, massive industrial capacity, and democratic funding, had defeated the centralized, secretive Soviet system on the final frontier. The political purpose of the Apollo program was fulfilled completely. The Soviet Union, despite its initial spectacular lead, was forced to quietly abandon its own lunar program. The sustained effort and immense financial investment required to reach the moon were simply beyond its strained, opaque economic capacity. The enduring legacy. The story of the tiny, beeping sphere and the $250 billion journey to the moon is not simply a narrative of technological achievement. It is the story of how fear can be the most potent catalyst for innovation. The Apollo program, conceived in political panic and executed under the shadow of the missile gap, fundamentally transformed the United States. The massive investment did not end with the moon rocks. The technologies developed, miniaturized digital computers, advanced materials, science, telecommunications, and high-speed organizational structures, cascaded into every sector of the American economy. The fear of Soviet ICBMs gave rise to NASA and ARPA, the institutions that would later create the foundations for the modern Internet and GPS. The reason a tiny 23-inch aluminum ball so profoundly terrified the world's richest superpower into spending $250 billion and hurling 3 men to the moon was that the sphere was not a scientific instrument. It was a strategic declaration of vulnerability that struck directly at the core American belief in its own technological superiority. It forced a massive, national reckoning that exposed the complacency of the defense establishment and resulted in an unprecedented, decade-long mobilization. The beep, beep, beep was the sound of a starting pistol. The journey to the moon was the race that followed, a race that restored American confidence, redefined the limits of human possibility, and proved that a democratic, industrial system, once fully mobilized, could answer any challenge the world could pose. The legacy of that panic lives on, not in the dust of the moon, but in the technological systems that define our modern world.